Back in the earlier days of consumer-ready VR, headsets only allowed for movement within 3 degrees of freedom, which meant you could only move your head around. If you tried to walk in real life or peek around an object, the world would follow you, instead of you being able to move through the world. This also meant that you couldn't track a controller within 3D space the way you can now with headsets like the Quest. But that didn't stop creators from making the incredible immersive experiences that were responsible for that iconic image of players in headsets with their mouths hanging open. But unless you had large amounts of disposable income and could afford the super expensive versions of VR headsets and gloves, or you had access to a printer to print out your own paper remotes, the most common input method for these early consumer VR headsets was gaze targeting. It's very important not to get gaze targeting confused with the newer gaze and pinch input on the Apple Vision Pro. It's a completely different technology. While the Apple Vision Pro uses sensors and cameras to track your eye and hand movement, gaze targeting uses the motion of the headset, and the center of the field of view is what targets your selection. It's kind of like in video games where you have the target reticle at the center of your screen. Only in this case, instead of moving the camera with your mouse or game controller joystick, you're moving your head and the headset. Even though headset technology is much more advanced now, gaze targeting is still used as a backup method of input in the event the controllers aren't being detected, or if the environment's too dark to track your hands or controllers well. But don't rule out gaze targeting if you do have a newer headset, since gaze targeting can be used as an accessible input for people with motor function impairments. And with a little bit of imagination and creativity, you can do some pretty cool interactions with gaze targeting in the newer headsets. One of the most common uses I've seen with modern headsets is safety training. For example, you could use gaze targeting to verify whether or not an object has been checked during safety inspection rounds. This is especially useful for headsets that don't have eye tracking. And with that in mind, it would still be useful to know the best practices for gaze targeting interactions. There are, that I know of, 2 ways to interact with objects with gaze targeting. The first one is delayed timer on hover. That means you hover the gaze targeting reticle over the selection you want to make. Then after a certain amount of time, the selection is activated. Do be aware that there is a much greater risk of accidental clicks or selections with a hover-based gaze targeting. So you'll need to include a visual load timer on the reticle as a countdown to activation. Also keep in mind that time delays require people to keep their head in the target area for longer periods of time than would be natural or comfortable. So make sure to keep that in mind when determining the timing of your delays, as well as the placement of the interactable objects and UI elements within your space. Not only do you want to help prevent people from hurting their necks, you also want to prevent accidental clicks. If you pay attention to how humans behave, which you should be doing if you're a UX designer, you'll notice that when we're wearing a VR headset and we're waiting for a new scene to load, we tend to put our heads in a neutral position, looking straight forward. And we really need to keep that in mind for a new scene load, because if we're using a delayed time on hover, anything that's directly in front of us where we're naturally gazing is going to automatically be in the line of sight for selection. That means as soon as the scene loads, the timed hover countdown will start if something's placed in the center of the field of view. So if you need to use a delayed time on hover, think about the placement of objects and UI panels. For example, maybe delay the load of the interactable objects until the rest of the scene's completely loaded in, or try placing objects slightly to the side of the center. Use your creativity to counter this potential problem. And while we're on the topic of human behaviors, when we talk, our heads and hands tend to move. Besides content creators who record or stream in VR while talking to their audience, or people with family around them, in medical or training situations, people will often talk to coworkers or trainers while they're in the headset, and they'll often reflexively look towards the sound of the person talking to them. Or if you're using gaze targeting as an option for people with motor function impairments, unintentional neck movements or jitters could make interactions difficult. This is important to consider because with gaze targeting, we're relying on head movements to make interactions. Depending on the sizing and distance of the target object, any slight head movement could result in an accidental click, or it could completely cancel a hover-based interaction. You can counteract this by using gaze stabilization. Talk to your friendly neighborhood developer to see how that can be implemented into your project. Now, the second type of gaze targeting activation is to press a button while you're hovering the reticle over an object or UI element. On newer headsets like the Oculus Quest, that's usually the volume button. You can still find old phone-based cardboard headsets on the market, but don't spend any more than $10 on one. Most of the experiences aren't supported anymore, so it will most likely end up collecting dust on your shelf like my old headsets. On the old phone-based cardboard headsets, there's a button somewhere on the side of the headset. And that button is touch capacitive, which means it emulates touch with your finger and aligns with your phone to press the screen, which then activates the selection. You can also find old phone-based headsets on the market that have a remote control clicker that you can press to activate selections. But don't think of it like a Quest controller. It's not trackable in space on your phone. It's more like a remote clicker for slide presentations, or a remote control for your TV. So don't spend money on this type of headset expecting to do more than simple clicks. It's still nothing more than a gaze target and a button press. As far as which type of gaze targeting interaction is best, it depends on your specific use case. It's more of a choice now than it used to be. If you're designing for modern headsets with trackable controllers, design for those. Don't use gaze targeting unless you have a specific use case, like motor function impairments, or for training or safety inspections where you need to confirm that they've looked at something. And of course, use your imagination. There could be another interesting use for it that I haven't thought about. But when you're deciding whether or not to use gaze targeting, do remember that there is a higher risk of accidental interactions since you're relying on head movement instead of more precise hand movement. However, we can counteract those risks with smart design decisions. If you come from a UX or game design background, you know that placement and spacing of the various objects and UI elements is important in order to reduce accidental interactions. The same is true for XR and gaze targeting. You want to thoughtfully place your objects and UI elements within the virtual space so that you don't accidentally select the wrong thing. And just like the need for minimum sizes on touchscreen interactions, you need to set minimum sizes, spacing, and target areas for objects and UI elements in virtual space. Not only will it help with accuracy, it will also help reduce any erratic switching between objects that are too close together, which can get very annoying very quickly. Also know that regardless of the input method, accuracy gets more and more difficult the further away an object is from the person. So the size of the target area will need to increase the further away from a person it gets. And as the distance from the person increases, the objects will need to be spaced further and further apart. You can also use visual feedback to improve accuracy by increasing the size of the target area on hover. So be sure to provide visual and audio feedback to let people know when they're hovering over something selectable. Also provide visual and audio feedback when the target's selected. And because we're dealing with less accurate head movements, gaze targeting limits the level of immersion within the experience, since it's a less natural way of interacting with the world. Immersion can also be broken if you're showing the reticle all the time. This is way more noticeable in VR than it is on a desktop or a console. So you'll want to think about when the reticle should and shouldn't show to avoid interference with immersion. And finally, make sure that any objects or elements you want people to interact with through gaze targeting are placed within the head comfort zone, and that they don't require fast response head movements. This will help reduce the risk of neck strain or injury. Let me know in the comments some of the creative ways that you've seen gaze targeting being used in XR experiences. If you want a summary of these best practices, check out the show notes. I've included a link to my article about best practices for gaze targeting. You can click on the screen right now to learn more about head and neck comfort. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one.